My entitled neighbor tried to use my private driveway for her daughter's wedding. I live on a 12-acre property just outside the city limits. I inherited the land from my grandfather, and it includes a long half-mile paved driveway that connects my house directly to the county highway. It's not a dirt path or a gravel trail. It's a proper, legally recorded, privately paved road that costs me a small fortune to seal and maintain every few years. The property itself is mostly dense, old-growth oak and pine, with a cleared pasture up near my house. For 30 years, it was dead quiet. The only traffic was me, the mail carrier, and the occasional lost delivery driver. A few years ago, a real estate developer bought 300 acres of dense forest bordering the western edge of my property. They brought in the excavators, tore down decades of timber, and flattened the earth to build one of those luxury subdivisions. You know the kind. Massive, identical, oversized houses crammed under quarter-acre lots, completely devoid of trees, each one trying to outdo the next. The backyards of the houses on their eastern perimeter pressed right up against the edge of my land, separated only by an old wire fence my grandfather strung up in the 80s. That is how I met Helen. Helen bought the biggest house in the new development, a sprawling gray monstrosity with too many roof lines and a massive back deck. It sits directly adjacent to the midpoint of my private driveway. Because her house is tucked all the way in the back corner of her neighborhood, her official subdivision entrance is on the complete opposite side of the development. To leave her house and get to the driveway, she has to navigate a maze of winding residential streets, wait at four-way stops, and crawl over a half-dozen speed bumps. It takes a solid 10 minutes just to get out of her own neighborhood. My driveway, on the other hand, is a straight, unimpeded half-mile shot directly to the highway. I guess Helen decided her time was far too valuable to deal with the infrastructure she bought into. One afternoon, I was sitting on my front porch with my dog, replacing the grip on my fishing rod, and I heard the distinct, aggressive crunch of tires on gravel. I looked up and saw a silver Mercedes SUV flying down my driveway at 40 miles an hour. It kicked up a massive, swirling cloud of dirt and dust, completely ignoring the peace sign on the private property, no trespassing signs that I posted at the entrance. I didn't even have time to stand up before she blew past my house and merged on the side. I put my hand down, hopped in my truck, and drove down to the midpoint of my land where the dust trails seemed to originate. I got out and walked the tree line. Sure enough, Helen hadn't just taken a joyride. She had actually hired someone to cut a 12-foot gap in the heavy gauge boundary wire fence between our properties. They hadn't just snipped it, they had rolled the wire back and pinned it to the adjacent trees, creating a perfectly clear, feminine thoroughfare. The fresh tire ruts in the soft grass led straight from her manicured backyard lawn, across my property line, and onto my feet. She had built herself a private on-ramp. I didn't march over and pound on her door. I don't like arguing with people, and I prefer to let reality do the talking. The next day, I woke up early, drove my heavy-duty Chevy Silverado down to the midpoint of the driveway, parked it horizontally directly in front of the gap she had cut, and turned the engine off. I rolled down the window, poured a cup of coffee from my thermos, and waited. It didn't take long. Around 8:30 a.m., I heard the back door of her house slam. The silver Mercedes backed out of her garage, drove across her backyard, and headed straight for the gap. She hit the brakes hard when she saw my truck blocking the path. I stepped out of my truck and flagged her down. She rolled her window down about 4 inches. The inside of her car smelled strongly of expensive floral perfume. She was wearing massive, dark designer sunglasses and clutching a tiny, trembling lapdog against her chest. Before I could even say good morning, she let out this exaggerated, dramatic sigh, shifting her weight in the leather seat like I was a highly inconvenient traffic cone she had to deal with. I kept my voice calm. I politely explained that this was a private driveway. I told her I owned the land. I paid to pay it. I paid to maintain it, and she could not use it as her personal shortcut to avoid the subdivision traffic. She let out this sharp, obnoxious laugh. It was a grating sound, the kind of laugh people use when they want to make sure you know that things are cheap. She adjusted her sunglasses and told me I was being completely ridiculous. She said she had checked the county zoning maps herself, and my driveway was clearly an unrecorded public easement meant for community access. I told her there was no such thing as an unrecorded public easement on my deed. I told her I literally pay the property taxes on every single inch of the pavement she was idling on, and she needed to turn her car around, go back through the fence she had and use her own neighborhood bridge. She didn't even let me finish. Mid-sentence, she hit the button to roll her window up, completely cutting me off. She threw the SUV into reverse, backed up a few feet, cranked the wheel hard, and drove entirely around my truck. She tore right through my tall grass, spitting mud onto my tailgate, bumped back onto the driveway, and sped off toward the highway. I stood there in the quiet, looking at the fresh muddy ruts she'd just carved into my property. I wasn't going to play games with her. The next morning, I drove down to the local farm and hardware store. I bought 2 heavy 4-inch steel pipes, thick hardy steel logging channels, a commercial heavy-duty padlock, and 4 bags of quick-setting concrete. I drove back, mixed the concrete in my wheelbarrow, and dug 2 deep holes right across the exact center of the gap she had made in the fence. I sank the steel posts deep into the earth, filled the holes with concrete, and leveled them off. Once the concrete cured, I wrapped the logging chain tightly around both posts and locked it. It was thick, heavy, and undeniably permanent. I thought that would be the end of it. I figured she would see the posts, realize I wasn't a pushover, and go back to using her own streets. I was very wrong. 2 days later, I came home from work, driving up from the highway. As I passed the midpoint of the land, I hit the brakes. The heavy steel chain was lying in the dirt. I got out and inspected it. It hadn't been unbolted or tampered with. The heavy steel links were sliced clean through. Someone had taken a pair of massive, commercial-grade bolt cutters to my property, and right beside the severed chain were fresh, wide tire tracks running from her pristine backyard. I was furious. It's one thing to be entitled. It's another to destroy someone's property because you don't like being told no. I immediately called the police non-emergency line. A deputy came out a few hours later, took a look at the cut chain, and sighed. He took down my statement, but he was entirely blunt with me. Without video proof of Helen actually holding the bolt cutters and snapping the chain, or footage of her car crossing the line after the fact, they couldn't do much besides file a trespassing and vandalism report. He gave me a card with a case number, told me to put up cameras and away. That night, I sat at my computer and ordered a set of high-end, motion-activated, cellular-linked trail cameras. I paid extra for overnight shipping, planning to mount them in the trees, pointing directly at the boundary line the second they arrived. But before the cameras even shipped, Helen escalated things to a level of audacity I couldn't even comprehend. It was a Saturday morning, lit up. The air was crisp, the leaves were and it was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I woke up around 7 o'clock, not to the sound of birds, but to a deep, vibrating rumble. Heavy diesel engines were idling so loudly that the single-pane windows in my old farmhouse were actually rattling their frames. I threw off the blankets, pulled on the chains and walked out of the house, rolling slowly past my house, right across my property with a conflict. There were 3 massive, refrigerated catering box trucks, a long panel van covered in florist logos, and an enormous heavy-duty pickup hauling a portable, multi-stall, luxury ice cream crate. They were crawling down my driveway, kicking up dust and turning directly into Helen's backyard through the gap where my chain used to be. I walked down the driveway to figure out what the hell was happening. When I reached the property line, I stopped. Her entire massive backyard had been transformed overnight. There was a huge, white, heavy-duty event tent erected over her lawn. Hundreds of white wooden chairs were stacked in rows. Floral arrangements were being unloaded by the dozen, and a crew of people were laying down a temporary wooden dance floor. I spotted a guy in a polo shirt holding a clipboard and shouting directions at the crew unloading the nearest truck. I walked straight up to him and asked him what exactly he was doing driving commercial vehicles onto my property. He looked confused, wiped his forehead, and pulled out his clipboard. He flipped to a printed packet of papers and handed me a sheet. He told me the homeowner, Helen, had explicitly directed all vendors, delivery drivers, and staff to use the rear service road for the event. He said she told them the front subdivision streets were too narrow for commercial box trucks to navigate safely, and the HOA had strict rules against heavy vehicles parking on the residential curbs. I looked at the paper he handed me. It was a printed Google map of the area. Helen had taken a red marker, circled my private driveway, and literally labeled it Helen's event service entrance. She had given them my road as her personal logistical solution. I didn't yell at the catering manager. He was just a guy trying to do his job based on the information he was given. I handed the paper back to him. Then, I looked up past the tent toward the massive gray house. Standing on her elevated second-story back deck, wearing a flowing silk morning robe and holding a glass of orange juice and champagne, was Helen. She was staring down at me. When she saw me looking at her, she didn't flinch. She didn't look guilty. A slow, smug, incredibly triumphant grin spread across her face. She raised her mimosa glass slightly in my direction, gave a tiny, mocking nod, and turned around to walk back inside. In that moment, I understood exactly what her play was. She thought she had outmaneuvered me. The trucks were already there. The tent was up. The wedding was happening today. She assumed I would just stand there, seething, maybe yell a little bit, but ultimately back down because no normal person is going to actively ruin a young woman's wedding day. She thought I would absorb the disrespect, let her trample all over my property, and eat the loss just to avoid a massive scene. She severely underestimated how stubborn I am, and she drastically miscalculated how much I care about her daughter's special day. I didn't yell. I didn't say a single word to the caterer, and I didn't say a word to Helen. I turned around, shoved my hands in my pockets, and walked at a normal, steady pace right back up to my house. I went into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, drank half of it standing at the sink, and then walked out the back door to my large, detached metal workshop. I have a hobby. I restore old farm equipment. Sitting dead center in my shop is a vintage bright yellow John Deere industrial bulldozer. It has steel treads, a massive front blade, and a heavy rear ripper. It weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 pounds. It is a terrifyingly heavy piece of machinery. It is also completely, hopelessly immobile. I am in the middle of a total transmission rebuild. The guts of the machine are sitting on a workbench. The engine hasn't turned over in 6 months. It is basically a 5-ton yellow paperweight. But I also own an industrial heavy-duty winch system bolted to the floor of my shop, and I own a working dual-axle flatbed utility truck meant for hauling heavy loads. I spent the next 2 hours doing very careful, very heavy work. I backed my flatbed up to the shop doors. I ran the thick steel winch cables out, hooked them to the heavy tow points on the front of the dead bulldozer, and slowly, agonizingly dragged that massive piece of steel out of the shop and up onto the reinforced bed of my trailer. The flatbed groaned under the weight, the suspension compressing heavily. I strapped it down with heavy-duty chains, ratcheted everything tight, and climbed into the cab of my truck. I drove down my driveway at 5 miles an hour. I drove right past my house, right past the trees where the property line met Helen's yard, ignoring the caterers who stopped to watch me pass. I drove all the way to the very end of my half-mile driveway, right where my pavement meets the county highway. I parked the flatbed completely horizontal, blocking the exit. I unhooked the chains. I ran a heavy snatch block and winch cable to a massive ancient oak tree on the edge of the property line, and then, pulling the levers, I slowly dragged that dead 5-ton bulldozer off the trailer. It hit the asphalt with a sickening, heavy thud that shook the ground. I unhooked the cables, packed up my gear, and pulled my truck forward. The John Deere sat perfectly horizontally across the very front of my driveway. From the heavy steel blade on the left to the ripper attachment on the right, it spanned the entire width of the pavement. There was a steep, heavily wooded ditch on one side and a deep drainage culvert on the other. Nothing wider than a bicycle was getting around that machine. The exit to the county highway was entirely, hopelessly blocked. I disconnected the trailer, drove my truck back up the grass shoulder of the driveway, parked in my garage, closed the door, and walked up to my front porch. I pulled up an Adirondack chair, grabbed my dog, and waited. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guests started arriving. Because Helen was so deeply committed to her lie, and because she wanted to avoid the subdivision gate guards asking questions to hundreds of people, she had actually printed my private driveway address on the formal wedding invitations. The first car to arrive was a black Audi. They pulled off the county highway, saw the dead bulldozer blocking the pavement, hesitated for a moment, and then slowly drove their passenger side tires into the shallow part of the grass ditch to squeeze around the edge of my property line, bypassing the blockage to get onto the driveway. They drove up my half-mile road, reached the area near my house, and clearly didn't know where to go. They saw the tent in the distance through the trees, so they just pulled off the pavement and parked right on the grass of my front pasture. I didn't stop them. I just sat on the porch, scratching my dog's ears, and watched. Then came a Lexus, then a Range Rover, then a line of BMWs and Mercedes sedans. They all did the exact same thing. They squeezed past the tractor on entry, drove up my road, and parked on my grass. They got out in their expensive suits and flowing dresses, completely ignoring my house, and walked across my pasture toward the gap in the fence to get to Helen's backyard. By 3 o'clock, there were at least 60 luxury cars parked completely randomly all over my front pasture. The driveway itself was choked with vehicles. At 3:30, I heard the faint sound of a string quartet starting up. The wedding ceremony had begun under the tent. I spent the afternoon fixing my fishing rod, drinking a few beers, and enjoying the weather. At 6 o'clock, the sun started to dip below the tree line. The reception was going strong. I could hear the thumping bass of a wedding DJ playing standard party anthems. That was when the first catering shift ended. One of the massive refrigerated box trucks fired up its diesel engine. It pulled out of Helen's backyard, drove up my driveway, and headed for the county highway to leave. About 3 minutes later, the truck laid on its horn. A long, loud, aggressive blast. The box truck was way too wide to squeeze around the bulldozer through the shallow ditch like the passenger cars had. It was trapped. Then, a vendor van full of floral equipment pulled up behind the box truck. Then, a few older guests who were trying to leave the reception early got into their cars, drove down the driveway, and pulled up behind the florist van. Within 20 minutes, a massive, unmoving line of vehicles had formed. It was a complete bottleneck. Commercial trucks, vendor vans, and angry rich people were boxed in. The honking became a continuous, chaotic symphony. My cell phone started buzzing on the table next to me. The caller ID showed numbers I didn't recognize. I let it ring. It stopped and started again. I ignored them all. Finally, I saw movement coming up the driveway. It was Helen. She was sprinting up the pavement in an incredibly expensive, pale blue mother-of-the-bride dress. She was moving with a frantic, desperate energy. Because she was running on my unlit, dirt-dusted driveway in the fading light, she kept stumbling. By the time she reached the bottom of my porch stairs, her silk heels were completely ruined, coated in mud and dust. Her face was bright purple. The smug, triumphant woman from this morning was gone. She looked absolutely feral. She didn't even pause to catch her breath. She started screaming at me from the dirt, pointing a shaking finger at my face, demanding I move my disgusting, white trash tractor immediately. She told me I was holding her family hostage. She told me I was ruining her daughter's wedding. She told me she was going to sue me for everything I owned, take my land, and have me arrested for kidnapping. I let her scream until she literally had to stop to gasp for air. I didn't stand up. I took a slow sip of my beer, set the bottle down on the armrest, and looked at her. I spoke in the calmest, flattest voice I could muster. I told her that, unfortunately, my vintage bulldozer had suffered a catastrophic transmission failure while I was attempting to move it across my own private property. I explained that because it was Saturday evening, my heavy machinery mechanic wasn't available, and I wouldn't be able to get a crew out here to tow it until Monday morning at the earliest. Move it, she shrieked, her voice cracking. Move it right now. My caterers have another event tonight. My guests need to leave. I shrugged. I told her that my property was completely impassable for vehicles, but she was more than welcome to direct her guests and vendors to use the front entrance of her house and navigate through her own subdivision streets to get home. Helen looked like she was going to have a stroke. Her hands were shaking violently. I can't, she screamed. The event tent takes up the entire side yard. The dance floor is blocking the gate. There is absolutely no physical way for a vehicle to drive from the backyard to the front street. You know that. You planned this. I looked at her, completely deadpan. Well, Helen, I said, that sounds like a severe logistical oversight on your part. She let out a sound that was half scream, half sob, pulled her phone out of her clutch, and dialed 911. She stood in my driveway, glaring daggers at me, and told the dispatcher that a dangerous, unhinged man was illegally imprisoning hundreds of people on his compound and demanding a ransom. 30 minutes later, 2 county sheriff squad cars came flying down the highway. They hit their sirens when they saw the bulldozer parked on the shoulder, and 2 deputies had to physically squeeze past the tractor and walk the half-mile up my driveway. When they arrived at the porch, Helen launched into the performance of a lifetime. She cried literal, streaming fake tears. She clutched her chest. She pointed at me and screamed that I was a lunatic, that I had trapped them maliciously, and that her elderly relatives were having panic attacks in their cars. The lead deputy, an older guy with a gray mustache who looked like he had zero patience for this kind of drama, held up his hand to silence her. He walked up my porch stairs and asked me what was going on. I didn't argue. I reached under my chair, pulled out a manila folder I had prepared hours ago, and handed it to him. Inside was the official, notarized county deed to my property, clearly showing I owned the land all the way to the highway. Behind that was the official plot map, and behind that was a copy of the police report from a week prior, detailing the vandalism and cutting of my my chain fence by an unknown party originating from Helen's property. I calmly explained to the deputy that Helen had explicitly instructed over 60 unauthorized vehicles and heavy commercial trucks to trespass on my land without my permission. I told him that I was in the process of doing maintenance on my own land when my equipment unfortunately broke down right near the property line. The officer looked at the deed. He looked at the printed police report. He looked down the driveway at the massive line of trapped luxury cars and the catering trucks. Then he turned and looked at Helen. The deputy's expression hardened. He walked down the stairs, stood inches from Helen, and spoke in a low, firm voice that carried clearly in the quiet evening air. "Ma'am," he said, "you are standing on private property. Every single vehicle parked in that pasture is trespassing. Every single commercial truck idling on this pavement is trespassing. You are incredibly lucky this gentleman is not demanding we impound every single one of those cars and issue criminal trespassing citations to every guest at your daughter's wedding," Helen stammered, pointing at the bulldozer. But he blocked us in. He has to move it. Make him move it." The deputy shook his head. "I cannot make him do anything. His equipment is legally parked on his own land. It is broken down. It is not a crime to have a broken tractor on your own driveway. This is a civil matter. If you want to sue him, you can hire a lawyer on Monday. But right now, we are leaving." Helen's jaw dropped. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on her. "How are my guests supposed to get home?" she whispered, the fight completely draining out of her. The deputy adjusted his utility belt. "That is your problem, ma'am, not his. I suggest they start walking." And walk they did. For the next 3 hours, I sat on my porch and watched the most glorious parade of misery I have ever witnessed. Because the cars were trapped and the front of Helen's house was blocked by her own event tent, the guests had only one option to escape. They had to abandon their expensive cars in my pasture. Every single wedding guest, dressed in tailored suits, silk gowns, and stiletto heels, had to walk the half-mile down my dirt-dusted, pitch-black driveway. They were hauling massive gift boxes, carrying suit jackets, dragging sleepy, crying children, and complaining loudly into the night. When they finally reached the end of the driveway, they had to squeeze single file past the oily treads of my bulldozer, stand on the gravel shoulder of the dark county highway, and wait for expensive rideshare cars to come pick them up. The caterers and the florist were completely screwed. They couldn't leave their perishable food to rot, so they had to leave their massive refrigerated box trucks idling on my driveway all night long, burning through expensive diesel fuel, while the staff grabbed their personal belongings and hiked out to the highway to call cabs. I went to bed around midnight. It was the best sleep I'd had in years. I woke up on Sunday, made coffee, and completely ignored the cars in my yard. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't go outside. I just enjoyed a quiet day in my house. On Monday morning, around 8 o'clock, I walked out to my shop, grabbed my tools, and walked down to the bulldozer. I spent an hour underneath it, bolted a temporary bypass valve I had fashioned onto the transmission housing, fired up the engine, and backed the massive machine off the driveway, parking it securely in the grass. The exit was clear, but the entrance to my property, the heavy steel farm gate at the highway, was locked tight with a thick chain and a commercial padlock. I set up a folding camping chair right next to the gate, brought out a thermos of coffee, a lockbox, and a stack of printed, itemized invoices. Around 9 a.m., the first angry wedding guest arrived in an Uber to retrieve their abandoned car. They walked up to the gate, saw it was locked, and started to yell at me to open it. I didn't yell back. I just slid one of the printed invoices through the bars of the gate. "Overnight storage and security fee for unauthorized vehicles on private property," I said cheerfully. "$100, cash or Venmo." The guy looked at me, looked at the invoice, and cursed, but he didn't argue. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill, shoved it through the gate, and glared at me. I unlocked the gate, let him walk in, and locked it behind him. He drove his car out. I opened the gate, and he sped away. That process repeated itself over 60 times throughout the day. Not a single person called the cops, because they all knew they were legally in the wrong for parking on my land. Most of them gladly paid the $100 just to get their cars back and go home. And the best part wasn't the money, it was the conversations. Almost every single guest who handed me cash complained loudly, directly to me, about how absolutely insane Helen was. They were furious that she had given them fraudulent directions, furious that she had ruined the end of the wedding, and furious that she was refusing to answer their calls to reimburse them for the towing fees. The catering company showed up with a manager. They paid me a $500 release fee for their commercial trucks without batting an eye. The manager told me Helen was being hit with thousands of dollars in emergency overtime fees for the staff who had to abandon their shifts, fuel surcharges for the trucks idling all night, and penalties for equipment lockouts. By the end of the day, my pasture was empty, my driveway was clear, and I had over $6,000 in cash sitting in my lockbox. I used the money to hire a professional fencing contractor. They came out that week and installed an 8-foot-tall, heavy-duty commercial chain-link fence along the entire property line bordering Helen's backyard. It's cemented 3 feet into the ground. It has been 6 months since the wedding. I haven't heard a single peep from the subdivision. The gap is closed, the dust has settled, and my property is quiet again. If I sit on my porch in the evenings, I can sometimes see Helen standing on her massive back deck, looking out over her pristine lawn. But she never looks in my direction, and she certainly never drives near my fence. I thought the 8-foot chain-link fence was the end of it. For a solid 6 months through the winter, my property was dead quiet. The snow fell, the bulldozer sat happily in the shop getting its new transmission, and I spent my evenings by the wood stove with the dog. The new development behind me was nothing more than a faint glow of excessive exterior lighting through the bare oak trees. I should have known people like Helen don't just accept defeat. They don't learn lessons. They just change their tactics. Spring rolled around, the ground thawed, and the mail carrier drove up to my house and honked his horn. He needed a signature. It was a thick, certified letter from the County Department of Zoning and Code Enforcement. I opened it on the porch. Helen spent the winter building a bureaucratic war machine. The envelope contained a formal, multi-page complaint filed against my property. She had hired a land use attorney. The document claimed that my new chain-link fence was an illegal spike fence erected maliciously to destroy her property value. It also claimed that my property was operating as an unlicensed commercial parking facility, citing the $100 release fees I charged her wedding guests. Finally, it demanded an immediate environmental inspection, alleging that my derelict farm equipment was leaking the groundwater and endangering the subdivision. There was a notice tabled to the back. A county code inspector was scheduled to visit my property the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. Helen was trying to ground me in fines to force me to tear down the fence. Tuesday morning arrived. Right on time, a white County pickup truck pulled down my driveway. A guy in his late 50s, wearing a high-vis vest, war boots, and a tired expression, stood there. He introduced himself as Mark. He held a clipboard and looked like a man who had already dealt with too many angry neighbors that week. I shook his hand, offered him a cup of coffee, and told him he had free reign to pick whatever he needed to. We started with the unlicensed commercial parking facility. I showed him the pasture. It was just grass, currently occupied by 3 wild turkeys. I handed him the police report from the night of the wedding, showing that the cars were unauthorized trespassers, and the fee was a private property release, not a business transaction. Marcus nodded, made a quick check mark on it, and muttered something about rich people wasting county time. Next, we went to the shop. I showed him the John Deere. It was fully reassembled, parked on a concrete slab, not leaking a drop of oil. The shop was clean, organized, and up to code. Another check mark. Finally, we walked down the property line to look at the spike fence. As we approached the chain-link area, I saw Blueprint on the other side. Helen had clearly been waiting for us. She was standing on her massive, multi-tiered composite deck, wearing another silk outfit, her arms crossed tight over her chest. When she saw the high-vis vest, she practically jogged down the stairs and hurried over to the fence. "Officer," she said, using a sickly sweet, entirely fake tone, "I'm so glad to find you here. As you can see, this hideous structure was built purely to harass me. It's an eyesore. It completely ruins the aesthetic of our luxury community." Marcus didn't smile. He pulled a laser measuring tape from his belt. He walked to the old iron survey can, marking the true property corner, pointed the laser, and measured the distance to the fence line. "Ma'am," Marcus said, not looking up from his device, "this is an agricultural zone parcel outside city limits. He doesn't belong to your HOA. He can build a fence out of purple shipping containers if he wants to, as long as it's on his side of the line." He checked the measurement, and it is. It's set back exactly 4 inches on his property. It's completely legal. Helen's sweet demeanor vanished instantly. Her face tightened. "That is unacceptable. I know the mayor. I know the head of the planning commission. This is a residential hazard." Marcus sighed. It was a heavy, exhausted sound. He finally looked up from his clipboard and looked directly at Helen. Then he looked looked past her. He looked at her immaculate, heavily landscaped backyard. He looked at the massive stone retaining wall she built. He looked at the sprawling, multi-level deck attached to the back of her house. He stared at it for a long, uncomfortable time. Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice completely flat. When was that deck built? Helen blinked, caught off guard. What? Before we moved in. The developer added it as a premium upgrade. Why? Marcus walked slowly along the fence line, looking at the slope of the land. He pointed his laser measurer at the edge of her deck and back to the property. He did it 3 times. He pulled a rolled up set of subdivision flat mounts from his back pocket and unrolled them against the chain link fence because, Marcus said, tracing a line on the paper, it cleaned. This subdivision has a strict 20-foot rear setback requirement for all permanent structures. It's a fire and drainage buffer. He looked back at her deck. Your deck is 15 feet deep. It terminates exactly 5 feet from this property line. Not only is it a gross violation of the county setback ordinance, but that stone retaining wall you've got holding up your flower beds is actively diverting the surface water runoff directly into this gentleman's property. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the wind in the pine trees. Helen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Did you pull a permit for the retaining wall? Marcus asked. The landscaper. Marcus pulled out a pen. I'll take that as a no. He started writing furiously on a pink carbon copy pad. He wasn't talking to me anymore. The inspection of my property was over. I'm citing you for illegal construction, an illegal hardscape addition, and a violation of the County Watershed Act. Marcus said, tearing off the pink slip and shoving it through the chain link fence. It fluttered to the grass. You have 30 days to submit an engineered remediation plan to the county, or we will place a lien on your property. Helen stared at the pink paper on the grass like it was a live grenade. Remediation? What does that mean? Marcus turned around and started walking back up the hill towards his truck. He didn't even look back. It means you're going to have to tear down the back half of your deck now. Have a nice day. I didn't say a word. I didn't smile. I just looked at Helen. She looked at me, her eyes wide, realizing that her attempt to weaponize the county had just blown up her own backyard. I turned around and walked back up to my house. 2 weeks later, the noise started. It wasn't a wedding DJ this time. It was the screaming whine of circular saws and a heavy, repetitive thud of sledgehammers. I sat on my front porch with a cold beer and watched through the trees as a crew of demolition contractors systematically dismantled the back half of Helen's massive, expensive deck. They tore out the composite boards. They pulled out the footings. An excavator came in and ripped out the stone retaining wall, leaving a massive, ugly dirt scar across her perfect lawn. It cost her thousands to tear it down, and it probably cost her thousands more in county fines. Later that same week, I was down by the highway entrance, checking the mailbox. A small black sedan pulled out of the subdivision, stopped at the stop sign, and idled next to my driveway. The passenger window rolled down. It was a young woman in her late 20s. I recognized her from the photos Helen had forced the caterers to put on their clipboards months ago. It was the bride, Helen's daughter. I braced myself for another screaming match. Instead, the young woman just looked at me. She looked at the heavy gate. She looked up the long, quiet driveway toward my house. I told her not to use your driveway, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, completely lacking her mother's frantic edge. I told her it was a terrible idea. She didn't listen. She never does. I just nodded. Weddings are stressful. A tiny, genuine smile broke across the young woman's face. For what it's worth, she said, making her walk a half mile in the dirt in that dress was the best wedding present anyone could have given my husband and me. We're moving to Chicago next week. Good luck with her. She rolled up the window and the car drove away. I locked my gate, walked back up the long paved road, and went into my shop. I fired up the bulldozer, put it in gear, and listened to the deep, steady rumble of a perfectly rebuilt transmission. It sounded beautiful. Summer hit hard that year. By late July, the ground was baked hard. The grass in the pasture and the air was thick and humid. With her deck chopped in half and her daughter moved away, I figured Helen would finally retreat into her air-conditioned house and leave me alone. But spite is a funny thing. It doesn't cool off. It just ferments. It was a Tuesday morning, pushing 90 degrees by 10 o'clock. I was in the shop running the bead well on the custom bracket when I heard it over the hum of my ventilation fan. The high-pitched, angry whine of a 2-stroke chainsaw. It wasn't a homeowner's electric trimmer. It was a heavy gas saw, and it was close. I cut the torch, flipped up my mask, and walked out the side door. The noise was coming directly from the property line. Bordering the chain link fence entirely on my side of the property is a row of massive, old-growth white oaks. My grandfather used to say they were 100 years old when he bought the place in the 70s. They are towering, magnificent trees. Because Helen's house was built right on the setback line, the canopy of the largest oak extended high over the fence, casting a deep, wide shadow over her remaining deck and her manicured backyard. When I got down to the fence line, I saw an unmarked, beat-up white box truck parked on Helen's grass. 4 guys in dirty t-shirts with zero safety gear were swarming the tree. One of them was 40 feet up in the canopy, tied off with a cheap rope, wielding a steel chainsaw. Property law regarding trees is very clear. If a branch hangs over your property line, you have the right to trim it straight up to the sky, exactly at the boundary line. But you cannot cross the line, you cannot trespass, and you absolutely cannot cut the tree in a way that destabilizes or kills it. Helen didn't care about the law. She cared about the leaves falling in her yard. The guy in the tree wasn't trimming along the boundary line. He was reaching directly across the 8-foot chain link fence, deep into my airspace, cutting massive, primary lateral branches right at the trunk. He was butchering the tree. As I walked up, he cut a limb the thickness of a telephone pole. It snapped with a violent crack, fell directly onto my side of the property, and crashed down hard onto my brand new chain link fence. The heavy steel top rail bowed inward under the weight, and the heavy gauge mesh buckled. Helen was sitting in a padded patio chair on her truncated deck under a patio umbrella. She was wearing oversized sunglasses, sipping a glass of iced tea. She watched the massive branch crush my fence, and she didn't even flinch. I walked up to the fence. I didn't yell. I looked at the guy running the wood chipper on her lawn. Shut it down, I told him. He couldn't hear me over the engine. I pointed at the chipper, then ran my finger across my throat. He frowned, but he reached over and killed the throttle. The sudden silence was ringing. The guy in the tree stopped cutting. A man with a clipboard walked over from the truck. He looked sweaty and annoyed. Can I help you, buddy? He asked, wiping his forehead with a dirty rag. You're trespassing in my airspace. You're dropping timber on my property, and you just destroyed a section of my fence. I said, pack up your gear and get off my tree. The foreman scoffed. The lady hired us to clear her canopy. We're doing a job. The tree is on my property. You are cutting branches on my side of the line. That's illegal. The foreman pointed a thumb over his shoulder at Helen. Take it up with her, man. I just get paid to cut. He turned around and signaled the guy in the tree to start his saw back up. I didn't argue with him. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I switched it to video mode. I filmed the unmarked white truck. I filmed the lack of license plates. I filmed the guy up in the tree, clearly leaning 3 feet over the fence line into my property, cutting another branch. I filmed the massive pile of oak limbs crushing my fence. And I filmed Helen sitting under her umbrella, watching the entire thing happen. Then I walked back up to my house, sat at my kitchen table, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to a licensed independent master arborist. The second was to my property attorney. People who live in subdivisions don't understand tree law. They think trees are just giant weeds that you can hack away at without consequence. But in agricultural and rural zoning, timber is heavily protected. There is a specific legal concept called timber trespass. If you maliciously damage or kill a tree on someone else's property, you don't just pay for the wood. You pay the replacement value of the entire living tree. And in my state, the penalty for timber trespass is automatic treble damages. You pay 3 times the value of the tree. The arborist came out the next morning. He was a quiet, thorough guy who spent 2 hours examining the white oak, taking soil samples, and measuring the trunk diameter. He took hundreds of photos of the massive, jagged cuts the crew had made against the main trunk. When he was done, he came up to the porch and sat down. He didn't have good news. They butchered it, he said, shaking his head. They removed over 60% of the living canopy, and they cut the primary leaders flush to the trunk on one side. They completely unbalanced the 30-ton living structure, and they didn't seal the cuts, which means oak wilt is going to set in by next spring. Is it going to die? I asked. Yes, he said flatly. But worse, it's a hazard now. With that much weight removed from the east side, the next major windstorm is going to snap the trunk, and because of the lean, it's going to fall directly backward. He pointed up the hill, right onto your detached workshop. He wrote up his formal report. Because of the size, age, and species of the tree, its estimated replacement and intrinsic property value was calculated at $34,000. It would cost another $6,000 to safely dismantle the ruined tree with a crane before it fell on my shop, and $1,500 $1,000 to repair the crushed chain link fence. Total actual damages, $41,500. I forwarded the arborist's sworn report to my attorney. My attorney applied the state's treble damages statute for timber trespass. 3 weeks later, Helen received a certified legal summons. She wasn't dealing with a county code inspector making $50,000 a year this time. She was dealing with a ruthless land use lawyer, suing her in civil court for $124,500 in damages, plus legal fees. I heard later from one of the other neighbors that Helen completely lost her mind when she read the lawsuit. She immediately tried to track down the tree service she had hired to throw them under the bus and make their insurance pay for it. She couldn't, because Helen was cheap. She hadn't hired a bonded, insured, legitimate tree service. She had hired a flyer she found stapled to a telephone pole. They had no commercial address, no business license, and the phone number she called went straight to a disconnected prepaid cell phone. They were a ghost crew, which meant Helen was personally, completely, and entirely liable for the entire amount. The lawsuit didn't go to trial. Her homeowner's insurance company took one look at the video of her sitting in a lawn chair, watching an unlicensed crew destroy my property, and they formally denied her claim, citing intentional and malicious acts. They refused to cover a dime. Helen had to hire her own expensive defense attorney. He took one look at the arborist's report, the video evidence, and the state statutes, and told her to settle immediately before I took her house. In late November, just before Thanksgiving, I received a certified cashier's check in the mail from Helen's legal team. It was for $95,000. She had been forced to take out a massive second mortgage on her luxury home just to pay me off and avoid bankruptcy. I cashed the check. I paid the $6,000 to have the ruined oak tree safely dismantled and removed. I paid $1,500 to fix the fence. I paid my lawyer. I took the remaining $80,000, called the heavy machinery dealership a town over, and bought myself a brand new, top-of-the-line, enclosed cab John Deere compact track loader with climate control, a Bluetooth stereo, and a forestry mulching attachment. I had them deliver it on a flatbed. They unloaded it right at the end of the driveway. I climbed in, turned on the AC, synced my phone to the stereo, and drove it slowly up my driveway, right past Helen's house. She was standing at her back, sliding glass door, looking out at the massive empty space where the beautiful oak tree used to be. She watched me drive my $80,000 piece of machinery, paid for entirely by her own spite, right up to my shop. She closed the blinds. She hasn't opened them since. The winter was brutal, but spring was worse. In this part of the country, late March and early April don't bring gentle showers and blooming flowers. They bring weeks of relentless, heavy, driving rain. The ground thaws, the soil saturates, and everything turns to a thick gray soup. My property drains well. My grandfather knew what he was doing when he graded the pasture, and the dense root systems of the old-growth forest handle the rest. Helen's property, however, was a completely different story. When the developers clear-cut the woods to build her subdivision, they altered the natural grade of the land to squeeze in those massive houses. Helen's lot, situated at the very back of the development, sloped steeply downward toward my property line. The only thing that had been keeping her heavily landscaped backyard from sliding down the hill was the massive, unpermitted stone retaining wall she had built. The same retaining wall the county code inspector had forced her to tear out. Compounding the issue was the fact that she had maliciously butchered my 100-year-old oak tree. That tree's massive, ancient root system had extended deep beneath her lawn, acting like a subterranean net that anchored the soil. Now, the tree was gone. Its roots were rotting in the wet earth, and the stone wall was nothing but a memory. By the second week of continuous April rain, the inevitable happened. I was sitting on the porch with my morning coffee, watching the downpour, when I heard a deep, structural groan, followed by a wet, heavy sliding sound. It wasn't loud, but you could feel it in the ground. I put on my raincoat and muck boots, walked down the driveway, and checked the property line. Helen's backyard was collapsing. A massive section of her lawn, roughly 40 feet wide, had liquefied. The sheer weight of the saturated dirt, with nothing left to hold it back, had slumped down the slope and crashed directly against my new commercial chain link fence. The 8-foot steel mesh was bowing outward under the immense pressure of thousands of pounds of mud, but the deep concrete footings I had paid for held firm. The mud piled up against the steel like water behind a dam. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was 20 feet up the slope, right near the back of Helen's house. Because the earth had shifted so violently, a massive, jagged sinkhole had opened up directly beneath the concrete footings of where her deck used to be. The erosion had reached the poured concrete foundation of her sprawling house. Even from 50 yards away through the rain, I could see a jagged black crack running vertically up the gray stucco of her rear wall. Her house was literally sliding down the hill. I didn't call anyone. I didn't take any pictures. I just turned around, walked back to my dry house, and went about my day. 2 days later, the rain finally stopped. The sun came out, baking the mud. Around noon, I was in the shop greasing the tracks on my new loader when a white commercial van with the logo of a prominent structural engineering firm pulled up my driveway. The van stopped short of the gate. A guy in a hard hat and mud-caked boots got out and walked up to the fence. He didn't look angry. He looked defeated. I walked down to meet him. "Hey," he said, handing me a business card through the chain link. "I'm the lead engineer working on the foundation failure at the property behind you. Lot 42. I saw the slide," I said. He took off his hard hat and rubbed his temples. "It's bad. The entire rear elevation is compromised. If we don't get a crew in there to drive steel pilings and pour a massive reinforced retaining wall within the next 2 weeks, the county is going to red tag the house and condemn it. It'll be a total loss." I nodded. "Sounds expensive." "Astronomical," he agreed. "But we have a logistical nightmare. The subdivision streets are too narrow and the houses are built too close together. There is absolutely zero clearance to get a track excavator or a concrete pump truck between her house and her neighbors, the only way into her backyard." He stopped and looked down my long, wide, paved private driveway, and then at the heavy steel gate blocking the entrance. "It's through here," he finished. "No," I said. "It wasn't a negotiation. It was a complete sentence." The engineer sighed. "Look, man, I get it. The homeowner told me there was some bad blood between you two, but I'm just trying to do my job and save a structure. We pay an access fee. We repair any damage to your asphalt. We just need to take down a 20-foot section of your fence, drive the heavy equipment through, and we'll rebuild it when we're done." "The answer is no," I repeated calmly. "That homeowner trespassed on my land, vandalized my property, illegally diverted water onto my soil, and maliciously killed a century-old tree. I'm not opening my gate so she can save the house she ruined with her own arrogance." The engineer didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, put his hard hat back on, and walked back to his van. "Can't say I blame you," he muttered before driving away. I figured that would be the end of it. The county would condemn the house, she would go bankrupt, and the bank would eventually bulldoze the lot. But I underestimated how desperate Helen was. The next morning, I was sitting on the porch when I saw someone walking up my driveway from the highway. It was Helen. She wasn't wearing silk. She wasn't wearing designer heels. She was wearing sweatpants, a plain gray t-shirt, and cheap rubber boots. She looked 10 years older than she had on the day of the wedding. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and there were dark, heavy bags under her eyes. She walked the entire half-mile of the asphalt, passing the spot where she had cut the wire, passing the spot where she had yelled at the police, passing the spot where I had parked the bulldozer. She stopped at the bottom of my porch stairs. She didn't scream. She didn't demand anything. She just stood there in the dirt, looking up at me. Her hands were shaking. "They're going to condemn my house," she said. Her voice was hollow, stripped of all the obnoxious entitlement that had defined her. "The bank will foreclose. I have a second mortgage I took out to pay you. If I lose this house, I lose everything. I will literally have nothing." I looked at her. I didn't feel sorry for her. Actions have consequences, and she had spent a year actively trying to ruin my life just to save herself a 10-minute drive. "The engineer said you told him no," she whispered. "I did." She swallowed hard. She looked down at her muddy boots, then back up at me. "What do you want?" she asked. "I don't have any more money. The lawyers took it all, but I need access to your driveway. Please, I'm begging you. What do you want?" I leaned back in my chair. I looked at the trees. I looked at my dog. Then I looked at Helen. "I want you out," I said. She blinked. What? I am not going to live next to you for the next 20 years waiting for your next unhinged scheme, I told her. I'll let the engineering firm use my driveway. I'll let them take down a section of the fence. I'll let them bring in the excavators and the concrete trucks to save the foundation. A wave of desperate relief washed over her face, but I held up my hand to stop her. On one condition, I continued. My lawyer drafts a binding, irrevocable contract. The second the foundation is stabilized and the house is no longer at risk of condemnation, you list the property for sale, you sell it, you pay off your debts, and you move out of this county. If you refuse to sign, or if you violate the terms, I lock the gate, the trucks leave, and your house slides down the hill. Helen stared at me. The reality of what I was demanding settled over her. She was losing her custom luxury home, the status she craved, and the neighborhood she had forced her way into. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to negotiate, but she looked at the cold, hard expression on my face, and she looked back down the long driveway. She knew she had absolutely no leverage left. So slowly, she nodded. Okay, she whispered, I'll sign it. My lawyer will email yours by email. I said, now get off my property. She turned around and walked the half mile back down to the highway. She signed the contract the next day. The engineers moved in on Monday. For 3 weeks, my driveway was a highway of heavy machinery, dump trucks, and concrete mixers. They dug out the mud, drove heavy steel beams 50 feet into the bedrock, and poured a massive engineered concrete retaining wall that completely stabilized the hill. They fixed my fence, pressure washed my driveway, and left. True to the ironclad contract, Helen listed the house the very next week. Because of the history of foundation issues, the ugly concrete wall replacing her backyard, and the desperate need to sell quickly, she had to list it well below market value. It sold in 30 days to a quiet retired couple from out of state who just wanted a place near their grandchildren. On moving day, I sat on my porch and watched the movers load her boxes into a truck parked on the street in front of her house. She didn't look toward my property once. When the truck was packed, she got into her silver Mercedes SUV, drove the long winding 10 minutes through the subdivision streets, over the speed bumps, and out the front gate. I haven't seen her since. The retired couple next door are great. On their first week, the husband walked down to the fence line, introduced himself, and asked if I knew anyone who sold good firewood. I loaded a cord of seasoned oak from the tree held to the bucket of my new tractor, drove it over to the fence, and passed the logs over to me. We drank a beer and talked about fishing. My property is quiet again. The pavement is clean, the gate is locked, and the vintage bulldozer is sitting in the shop, running perfectly, ready just in case anyone else ever decides my driveway is a shortcut. I really thought that was the end of the book on Helen. I had a signed contract, she was gone, and I had my peace and quiet back. The new neighbors, Jim and Martha, were incredibly respectful. They planted a row of fast-growing arborvitae on their side of the chain-link fence to give us both some privacy, and life returned to normal. I spent the rest of that year working in my shop, clearing brush with the track loader, and enjoying my life. I didn't think about the silver Mercedes, or the wedding, or the mudslide, but I forgot a fundamental rule about people who are deeply pathologically entitled. They don't process defeat like normal people. They don't reflect on their actions, realize they were wrong, and move on. They have sex, and even when forced into a corner, they will leave a landmine behind just to make sure you bleed. It was mid-November, about 8 months after Helen had packed up and moved away. The leaves were gone, the air was biting cold, and the ground was freezing solid. I drove my truck down to the end of the driveway to check a man. When I got to the county highway, I had to hit the brakes hard. Parked horizontally on the gravel shoulder, completely blocking my heavy steel gate, was a bright yellow State Department of Transportation utility truck. Its amber strobe lights were flashing. Two guys in heavy high-vis winter coats were setting up survey tripods on the edge of the asphalt, driving wooden stakes into the ditch with sledgehammers. I put my truck in park, got out, and walked up to the guy looking through the transit level. Morning, I said. You guys need me to unlock the gate so you can turn around? The surveyor looked up. He had a red, wind-chapped face. He shook his head. No, sir. We're not turning around. We're marking the right-of-way for the new guardrail installation. I frowned. The highway was a straight two-lane road. There were no curves here, no steep drop-offs on the opposite side. Just my driveway. Guardrail? I asked. Where exactly is it going? The surveyor pulled a roll of blueprints from a tube on the back of his truck. He unfolded on the hood. He pointed a gloved finger at the diagram. Right here, he said, tracing a thick black line. Continuous W-beam steel guardrail running 300 yards along the eastbound shoulder. It's a hazard mitigation project. I looked at where his finger was tracing. The line went directly across the entrance to my driveway. That's my driveway, I said, my voice dropping to register. If you put a guardrail there, my property is landlocked. I won't be able to get a vehicle in or out. The surveyor looked at me, then looked at the heavy steel gate, then back at his blueprint. I just pulled the measurements, man. But the work order says this is a decommissioned, non-compliant access point. The state is revoking the highway title. I've owned this access point for 30 years, I said. My grandfather owned it for 40 years before that. It's a legally recorded, paved, tax-assessed driveway. He shrugged, rolling the blueprint back up. Like I said, I described the stakes. You need to call the district dot office, but you better do it fast. The steel driving crew is scheduled to be here in 2 weeks. I didn't yell at him. He was just a guy freezing his ass off when his boss told him. I got back in my truck, reversed all the way up a half-mile driveway, walked into my office, and got on the phone. It took me 4 hours, 6 transfers, and a lot of money on the line to finally get a bid up manager. I gave him my parcel number and asked him why the state was suddenly trying to trap me on my own land. I heard him typing on his keyboard, then he sighed. Sir, your highway access is being revoked due to a documented public safety hazard. You received a formal citizen petition backed by photographic evidence proving that your driveway is being operated as an unpermitted commercial intersection. The sight lines do not meet state highway codes for commercial volume, and the traffic backups are creating a fatal collision risk on a 55-mile-per-hour road. I rubbed my eyes. Commercial volume. It's a driveway. I live here alone with a dog. The petition includes 24 photographs of a massive traffic jam. The manager said, see, commercial box trucks, vendor vans, and over 60 passenger vehicles stacked up on the highway shoulder trying to access your property. You are running an illegal event thing, sir. The state cannot allow you to maintain residential access if you're pulling that kind of volume. I felt the blood roaring in my ears. When was this petition filed? I asked. Let's see, the manager said. It was filed and sworn under oath on April 28th. April 28th, the exact day after Helen signed the legally binding contract to sell her house and leave the neighborhood. She knew she was losing her house. She knew she had been beaten. So, in a final act of pure distilled malice, she took the photos her own wedding guests had taken of the traffic jam she had explicitly caused, framed them as proof that I was running an illegal commercial business, and submitted them to the state government to have my driveway permanently barricaded. If she couldn't use my driveway, she was going to make sure I couldn't use it either. I need a copy of that entire file, I told the manager. Everything. The petition, the photos, the sworn affidavit. I'm filing a Freedom of Information Act request right now. You can do that, he said. But the guardrail goes up on the 12th. I hung up. I called my lawyer. When I sat down in my lawyer's office the next morning and laid the situation out, he actually laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a professional who couldn't believe the sheer audacity of the fraud he was looking at. We expedited the FOIA request through his legal credentials and got the digital file from the dot 2 days later. It was a masterpiece of manufactured victimhood. Helen had hired a professional traffic consultant, probably using the last of her credit to draft a 40-page safety hazard report. The report claimed my property was a nuisance commercial intersection. It included high-resolution photos of the caterers trapped behind my bulldozer. It included pictures of the guests walking down the driveway in the dark. But the most damning piece of paper was the sworn affidavit attached to the back. Helen had signed a legally binding notarized document under penalty of perjury, stating that she was a concerned neighbor who had repeatedly witnessed massive commercial events at my property, and that my negligence was going to get someone killed on the highway. She used her own crime as evidence to convict me. Can we get an injunction? I asked my lawyer. He shook his head. Injunctions against the state for safety infrastructure take months. The guardrail will be up before we even get a court date. If they block you in, you'll have to petition the subdivision for an emergency easement through their roads just to go to the grocery store. I thought about driving my truck through Helen's old neighborhood, over the speed bumps, dealing with the HOA. I felt physically sick. So what do we do? I asked. My lawyer leaned forward. We don't go to court. We go directly to the DOT, Regional Board of Commissioners. They have a public hearing scheduled for this coming Tuesday. They have the authority to unilaterally override a district work order, but we can't just tell them she lied. We have to prove she committed a felony to manipulate a state agency. agency. I spent the weekend building the heavy artillery. I didn't just grab the police report. I went into my records. I printed out the Google map the caterer had handed me, the one where Helen had physically circled my driveway and labeled it Helen's event service entrance in her own handwriting. I printed out the official wedding invitation that explicitly listed my private driveway address as the venue entrance. I printed out the itemized invoices I had charged the caterers, proving they were trespassing. And finally, I grabbed the video, the dashcam footage from my truck when she drove around me in the grass, and the security footage of her screaming at the police officers that she had directed her guests there. Tuesday morning, my lawyer and I walked into the Regional Department of Transportation building. It was a sterile, brightly lit room with a long, curved wooden desk at the front. 5 state commissioners sat behind microphones, looking incredibly bored as they listened to local contractors argue about paving bids. When my docket number was called, I didn't let my lawyer do the talking. I stood up, walked to the podium, and placed a thick, organized binder in front of the microphone. The lead commissioner, a woman with gray hair and severe glasses, looked down at me. Sir, you are here to appeal the right-of-way revocation for parcel 804. You have 5 minutes. I am, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. The state ordered this revocation based on a citizen petition claiming I operate an illegal commercial event venue. We reviewed the photographs, sir, the commissioner said dryly. The traffic backup on the county highway was severe. The hazard is documented. The hazard was documented, I agreed. But it wasn't my traffic. I am submitting Exhibit A. My lawyer walked up and handed a copy of the binder to the clerk, who passed it to the commissioners. Flip to page 3, I said. That is the official wedding invitation for the event shown in those photographs. You will notice the host is Helen, the woman who filed the petition. You will also notice she printed my residential address on her invitations to bypass her own subdivision's gate security. The commissioners flipped the page. The boredom started to drain from their faces. Now flip to page 4, I continued. That is the logistical map the petitioner handed to her commercial catering vendors, explicitly instructing them to trespass on my property. I kept going. I didn't stop. I walked them through the timeline. I handed them the police report where the county sheriff explicitly informed Helen that she was the one illegally directing traffic onto my land. I handed them the court settlement where she paid me $95,000 for maliciously destroying the trees on my property. The petitioner did not document a public safety hazard, I said, leaning into the microphone. The petitioner intentionally manufactured a traffic jam by directing 70 vehicles to trespass on my land. And when I stopped them, she took photographs of her own trapped guests and submitted them to this board under a sworn, notarized affidavit, claiming I was the one running a business. The room was dead silent. The lead commissioner was staring at the sworn affidavit with Helen's signature, comparing it to the wedding invitation. You do not mess with state bureaucrats. They don't care about neighborhood drama, but they care deeply about being used. Lying on a state form is one thing. Fabricating a massive, multi-departmental safety hazard response, wasting thousands of taxpayer dollars on surveyors, engineers, and legal reviews purely to settle a petty residential grudge, that is the kind of thing that makes government officials vindictive. The lead commissioner took off her glasses. She looked at the regional dot manager sitting in the front row. Cancel the work order on parcel 804 immediately, she snapped. The manager scrambled for his radio. Yes, ma'am. She turned back to me. Sir, your driveway access is secure. We apologize for the inconvenience. Then, she looked at her own legal counsel sitting at the end of the desk. She held up Helen's sworn affidavit. Counsel, she said, her voice dripping with ice. I want this entire file, along with this gentleman's evidence binder, transferred to the state attorney general's office by the end of the day. Flag it for felony perjury, filing a false public alarm, and defrauding a state agency. I walked out of the building. The cold air felt incredible. I never saw the guardrail crew. They never showed up. A few months later, I got a call from an investigator with the state. He wanted to verify some dates and ask a few questions about the timeline. I answered them honestly. He told me that Helen had moved 2 states away, bought a condo in a high-rise, and thought she had completely gotten away with it. She didn't. When the state brings charges, they don't just mail you a letter. They issue a warrant. Helen was pulled over for a broken taillight in her new city. When the officer ran her license, the out-of-state felony warrant popped up. She was handcuffed on the side of the road, impounded, and spent 3 days in a holding cell before she could arrange extradition back to my state to face a judge. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge to avoid prison time, but the state didn't let her off easy. She was hit with a massive criminal fine, sentenced to hundreds of hours of community service, and handed 3 years of strict probation. The felony conviction on her record meant she lost her lucrative corporate consulting job. I didn't go to the sentencing. I didn't need to. The matter was finally permanently settled. When spring rolled around again, I decided to do a little landscaping of my own. I drove my track loader down to the end of the driveway. I ordered 2 pallets of heavy, rough-hewn river stone and 50 bags of mortar. Over the course of 3 weekends, I built 2 massive, beautiful stone pillars on either side of my driveway entrance. They are 4 feet square and 6 feet tall. I set heavy steel hinge pins deep into the masonry. I bought a set of custom-welded, black powder-coated wrought iron gates, the kind you see at the entrance of old estates. I wired up a solar-powered automatic gate opener with an underground magnetic vehicle sensor for exiting and a keypad entry system for entering. It looks incredible. It makes the property look like a fortress. The best part is, anyone driving past on the county highway can see it. It's undeniably heavily private. I sat on the front porch with my dog yesterday evening. The vintage bulldozer is parked safely in the shop. The new neighbor, Jim, was running his riding mower on the other side of the chain-link fence, giving me a wave as he passed. The oak trees were full of green leaves, shading the exact spot where Helen's unpermitted deck used to be. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small black remote control for my new front gate, and pressed the button. Half a mile away, out of sight, the heavy iron gate swung smoothly closed, locking with a solid, satisfying mechanical click. Nobody is ever using my driveway again. You'd think the iron gates and the felony conviction would have been the final word. You'd think an entire neighborhood would look at what happened to Helen, a woman who literally lost her custom home, her corporate job, and her freedom because she couldn't handle being told no, and decide to permanently leave the guy with the bulldozer and the cameras alone. But entitlement is a communal disease. It doesn't just isolate itself to one person. It infects the culture of places like that subdivision. Helen was gone, but the homeowners association she had been a part of was still very much active, and the people running it were cut from the exact same cloth. It started in early June, about a month after I finished building the stone pillars at the highway. I was checking the mail down by the new gates when I found a crisp, cream-colored envelope mixed in with my electric bill and a Tractor Supply catalog. The return address was an embossed gold logo for the Whispering Pines Master HOA board. I opened it leaning against the hood of my truck. It was a formal notice of violation. The letter, printed on heavy stock paper, informed me that my new wrought iron entrance gates and stone pillars were in direct violation of the community's approved exterior aesthetic guidelines. It stated that the black powder-coated iron was too industrial, and that I was required to replace them with approved white vinyl carriage-style gates within 30 days. If I failed to comply, the letter warned, I would be subjected to a fine of $200 per day, and a lien would be placed on my property. It was signed by Richard, the president of the HOA. I actually laughed out loud. The sheer, unadulterated delusion it takes to send a zoning fine to a man who doesn't live in your neighborhood, doesn't belong to your organization, and owns 12 acres of agriculturally zoned county land bordered by a high-security fence is staggering. I didn't call Richard. I didn't write a letter back. I walked into my house, tossed the cream-colored envelope straight into the kitchen trash can, and went out to the shop to change the oil on my truck. 4 weeks passed. I completely forgot about the letter. Then, on a Tuesday morning, I got another envelope. This one was sent via certified mail. I had to sign for it at the post office. It was a final notice of assessment and impending lien. The HOA claimed I now owed them $6,000 in accumulated fines for my unapproved gates, plus a $500 administrative fee. But the second page was where things went from delusional to actively stupid. Richard and his board had decided to expand their jurisdiction. The letter stated that because several houses on the eastern edge of their subdivision had second-story windows that overlooked my property, my land was officially part of their visual corridor. Therefore, I was now subject to their nuisance regulations. They demanded I immediately remove the vintage John Deere bulldozer from my property, claiming it was an attractive nuisance and an eyesore. They also demanded I stop parking my flatbed trailer in the grass beside my shop. The letter ended with a threat. If the derelict equipment was not removed by Friday, the HOA would exercise its right of community preservation and have it towed at my expense. They were going to try to steal a 5-ton piece of heavy machinery off my private private land. I took the letter straight to my lawyer's office. He read it over, shook his head, and tossed it on his desk. They have absolutely no legal authority, my lawyer said, looking incredibly tired. Your deed predates their entire subdivision by 40 years. You have 0 restrictive covenants on your title. This is essentially extortion. I know it is, I said, but what happens on Friday when they actually send a tow truck onto my property? My lawyer leaned back in his leather chair. If a tow company hooks up to your equipment without your consent and without a court order from a judge or the police, it's grand theft auto. But we don't want it to get that far. I'll draft a cease and desist immediately and have a process server hand deliver it to this Richard guy tonight. No, I said. My lawyer paused. No, don't send the cease and desist, I told him. If you send it, they'll just back down, realize they made a mistake, and look for some other bureaucratic way to harass me from behind their desks. I want them to actually try it. My lawyer looked at me for a long time. He knows me well enough by now to know I don't bluff. You're setting a trap. I'm letting them step into their own, I corrected him. Friday morning arrived. I woke up early, made a large pot of coffee, and set up a folding chair inside my detached shop. I left the large roll-up bay doors wide open. The vintage yellow bulldozer was sitting right in the center of the concrete floor, gleaming. I had spent the winter painting the chassis. It looked brand new, but it still weighed 10,000 pounds. I pulled my flatbed truck and trailer out of the grass and parked it horizontally across the upper section of my driveway, completely blocking the path from the shop back down to the highway. Then I sat down, drank my coffee, and waited. At 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was an alert from the security camera mounted on my new stone pillars at the highway. I opened the app. A massive, heavy-duty commercial wrecker with a hydraulic flatbed and a rotating boom had pulled off the highway and was idling in front of my locked iron gates. The side of the truck said Apex Recovery and Towing. Following right behind the wrecker was a silver BMW sedan. A guy in his 50s wearing a tight golf polo and sunglasses stepped out of the BMW. It was Richard, the HOA president. I watched on the camera feed as Richard walked up to the wrecker driver, pointed at my gates. He was showing him the HOA bogus removal order. The tow truck driver looked at the gates. They were solid steel, locked tight. He shook his head and said something to Richard. Richard looked furious. He started gesturing wildly, pointing at the keypad on the stone pillar. I smiled, picked up my remote, and pressed the button. The heavy iron gates clicked and swung slowly open. On the camera, Richard looked slow. He probably thought his official HOA paperwork had somehow magically authorized the gate to open, or maybe he thought I had seen the error of my ways and was surrendering. The massive tow truck rumbled onto my property. Richard followed closely behind in his BMW. As soon as the rear bumper of the BMW cleared the threshold, I hit the button on my remote again. The heavy steel gate swung shut behind them and locked with a loud final click. I watched them drive the half-mile up a long, tree-lined driveway. They rounded the final curve and hit the brakes. My flatbed truck was blocking the road. There was just enough room to speed past it on the grass, but they went slowly. The wrecker driver navigated around the flatbed and pulled up right in front of the open bay doors of my shop. He put the truck in park, engaged the air brakes, and stepped out. He was a big guy, wearing dirty coveralls. Richard parked his BMW right behind the wrecker, stepped out, and walked into my shop like he owned the both. I was sitting in my folding chair, holding my mug of coffee. Can I help you? I asked. Richard puffed out his chest. I am Richard Vance, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. We are executing a community preservation order. This equipment is being removed. He turned to the wrecker driver. Look it up. The driver looked at the bulldozer, then looked at me. He didn't move. He wasn't stupid. Hey man, the driver said to me. He showed me the repo order. Said this was HOA property. I took a sip of my coffee. I looked at the driver. My name is on the deed to this thing. You are currently standing inside my private workshop. This bulldozer belongs to me. There is no banknote and there is no court order. If you touch that machine, I am going to have you arrested for attempted grand theft. The driver's face went pale. He immediately took 3 steps back from the bulldozer and held his hands up in the air. Whoa, hey, I just dispatched. Richard's face turned bright red. He's lying. The association has jurisdiction. I have the paperwork right here. He shoved his clipboard toward the driver. The driver didn't even look at it. He looked at Richard with pure disgust. Are you out of your mind, buddy? You can't authorize a tow on private county record. You lied to my dispatch. I'm out of here. The driver turned around, walked quickly back to his wrecker, climbed into the cab, and fired off a massive diesel engine. Right, Richard yelled, running after the truck. You have a contract with our neighborhood. You have to do what I say. The wrecker driver ignored me. He threw the truck into reverse, backed up onto the grass, turned around, and navigated back past my flatbed truck. He drove back down the long driveway toward the highway. Richard stood in the middle of my driveway, watching his hired muscle abandon me. He was completely alone. He turned around and glared at me. You think you can just ignore the rules? Richard sneered. We'll lien this entire property. We'll fine you until you have to sell it to the developer. I stood up from my chair. I didn't raise my voice. Richard, I said slowly, get off my property. He scoffed, turned on his heel, walked back to his BMW, and got in. He started the engine, threw it in gear, and sped off down the driveway, kicking up a rooster tail of dust. I didn't try to stop him. I just sat back down and watched the camera feed on my phone. A minute later, the wrecker arrived at the front gate. The driver got out, realized it was locked, and looked up at the camera. He waved his arms. I hit the remote. The gate opened. He drove out onto the highway, and I locked it behind him. 2 minutes later, Richard's BMW arrived at the gate. I didn't press the button. Richard sat in his car for a minute. The gate didn't open. He honked his horn. Nothing happened. He rolled down his window and punched a random code into the keypad. The little red light blinked, denying him access. He got out of his car and walked up to the camera. His face was purple. Open the gate, he screamed. I just watched the screen. He kicked the solid steel bars of the gate. He immediately grabbed his foot, hopping backward in panic. He pulled out his phone and made a call. I assumed he was calling the police. I welcomed it. 20 minutes later, the county sheriff's cruiser pulled off the highway with his lights flashing. It was the same older deputy with a gray mustache who had responded to Helen's wedding disaster almost 2 years ago. He got out of his cruiser, walked up to the gate, and looked through the bars at Richard. Then, security. I walked out of the shop, got into my truck, and drove the half-mile down to the gate. I parked, stepped out, and walked over to the fence wall. Morning, deputy, I said. The deputy. Morning, sir. Care to tell me what's going on here? This man is trespassing, I said, pointing at Richard. He unlawfully entered my property behind a commercial vehicle, attempted to steal my machinery, and is now refusing to leave my land. Richard lost his mind. He trapped me. He locked the gate. I am the president of the HOA. He owes us $6,000 in fines. Arrest him for kidnapping. The deputy sighed. It was the exact same heavy, exhaustive sound the code inspector had made a year ago. He looked at Richard. Sir, the deputy said, his voice flat. Are you the homeowner of this property? No, I live in Whispering Pines, Richard yelled. Then why are you inside this locked private gate? I was executing a community preservation order, Richard yelled, holding up his clipboard like a shield. He is in violation of our aesthetic guidelines. The deputy looked at the clipboard, then looked at me, then looked back at Richard. Sir, I don't care if you're the president of the United States. You cannot enter another man's locked property to enforce a neighborhood dispute. That is criminal trespassing. Richard's jaw dropped. But the fines, the gate. I don't care about your fines, he said, his voice hardening. You are trespassing. Now, this gentleman is going to open the gate. You are going to get in your car. You are going to drive away. And if I ever get called out here for you harassing him again, I'm going to arrest you and impound your vehicle. Do we understand each other? Richard looked at the deputy. He looked at me. The absolute crushing reality of his powerlessness finally hit him. His little HOA fiefdom meant nothing out here. He didn't say a word. He turned around, walked to his BMW, and got in. I pressed the button on my remote. The heavy iron gate swung open. Richard drove his car out onto the highway, didn't even look back, and sped away. The deputy waited until the gate closed and locked. He walked down the bar. You know, the deputy said, a small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. I've been working this county for 25 years. I've never seen one property generate so much self-inflicted misery for the people who try to mess with it. I just like my privacy, deputy, I said. He chuckled, tipped his hat again, and walked back to his cruiser. The next morning, my lawyer didn't send a cease and desist. He sent a massive, multi-page civil lawsuit directly to the Whispering Pines HOA board of directors. He sued them for attempted conversion of property, extortion, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He named Richard personally, bypassing the HOA's corporate shield because Richard had acted outside the scope of his legal authority. The HOA's insurance company panicked. They knew they couldn't defend it. Within a week, the board held an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to strip Richard of his evidence and remove him from the board entirely. The new board president, a guy actually understood property law called my lawyer, begging for a settlement. We didn't ask for a massive payout. I didn't want their money. I wanted a permanent, legally binding wall. The settlement terms were simple. The HOA agreed to completely void all bogus fines, formally acknowledge in writing that they had zero jurisdiction over my land, and cover 100% of my attorney's fees. Furthermore, they signed a permanent, legally recorded agreement stating that no current or future HOA board member could ever contact me, send mail to my address, or file a complaint against me ever again. If they violated the agreement, it triggered an automatic $50,000 penalty. They signed it the next day. I took a copy of the signed agreement, walked down to my shop, and pinned it to the corkboard next to the workbench. I fired up the vintage bulldozer just to hear it run and listen to the steady, powerful rhythm of the diesel engine. I haven't received a single piece of mail from the subdivision since. The new neighbors, Jim and Martha, occasionally pass a plate of cookies over the chain link fence, and I give them firewood in the winter. The iron gates stay locked, the security cameras stay on, and the 12 acres of old growth oak and pine remain exactly as my grandfather left them.